feeling that those two things don't go together. But you know, what I'm hoping we can do today is that we can talk about, what I say is talk about the hard stuff and also find spaces of hope. So we're going to tell the truth about what we're experiencing and what our students and colleagues are experiencing. And we're also going to look for opportunities to take care of ourselves and each other. And this tension came to me this morning in the form of these two quotes. So many people have heard this Edmund Burke quote, forgive the dated language. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. So I think many of us are, as we're seeing, you know, what's going on in the world, are feeling compelled to do more. And we're also having that feeling in the context of our own stress and trauma, right? So one of my favorite little reminders is de-stress. I say this to myself a lot, so hopefully it'll benefit some of you. Does anybody else ever try to run the entire solar system? A little bit? Yeah, so that doesn't work out well for me. So there's this tension in that we have so many things that we need to do. And in the context of this conversation, there is so much work to be done for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we also have to take care of ourselves. So for me, the work kind of sits in between these two ideas. And just focusing on what we can do and what we can control. And one of my other slogans that I use is one day at a time. I've been given this little parcel of time called today. What can I do today to take care of myself and to take care of others? So I think it's really important, and in not only to this session or today or the entirety of this conference, we're going to be asking, I believe, some really challenging questions about the work ahead. And we're also asking that in the context of, I saw on the news the other day that what we're experiencing in America, and I know we have an international audience, is a sort of a daily 9/11 in terms of the lives that are being lost to COVID. And we can't ignore that is having an incredible impact on our well-being. So we've got to name that, and we've got to acknowledge that the impact of that collective trauma is going to make it harder to do some of this work. And we're going to focus on doing what we can. I'm going to check in on the chat. Yes, Maha, you can screenshot and tweet. Oh, sugar. I did not share the slides, and I meant to do that. So I'm going to pop the slides in the, whenever I say, oh, sugar, my grandmother comes and visits me. So she's here now with us. Okay, so the slides are in the chat, and yeah, feel free to do whatever you want with this slide deck. Okay, so I want to hear from y'all. We're going to do a little check-in activity. It's called Rose and Thorn. This is something you can do with your learners. I try to use that word learners a lot in that I know we've got a lot of folks working with students and faculty, and I work with both, and we're all learners, right? So I'm going to invite you to do this. This is optional. So if you want to just watch, that's okay too. I'd like to invite you to share a rose and a thorn. A rose is something that's going well right now, and a thorn is something that's challenging you. So go ahead if you feel okay about that, and share in the chat. Amar is sharing being alive and attending this session as a rose. Oh, I've got to open up the slides. Okay. So let me go do that. Google Slides. Does anybody else do that every single time? This is modeling for you all what to do when you screw something up. You just name it and fix it, right? And every time somebody else does this, editor, done. Okay. Let me know if you can see those slides. Pretty please. And that link was lost. All right, I'm going to trust that you can see them. Yes, somebody's Meg. Oh, hi, Meg. Beautiful. All right, so if you haven't already shared a rose and a thorn, please do so. This is a nice activity that I think touches on trauma awareness because it acknowledges the hard stuff. It also creates space for hope. It also lets people decide the extent to which they want to dive into the hard stuff, right? So you can share that you ran out of your favorite popcorn as your thorn, or you might be sharing something really significant. So the learner gets to decide how far they want to go, right? So we never want to push somebody, or take their choice away from them or their agency. And Trisha, thank you. Trisha Marie is sharing heavy-heartedness at what's happening around us. And the roses are family. So lots of roses and thorns here. I also think it's really important when we're doing any kind of learning experience that we take time to check in with folks first. So that's another trauma-aware experience, teaching experience that we can share with our learners. And please feel free to keep sharing those roses and thorns. I'm seeing some really lovely ones there. Okay, so I pulled this off of our OLC Ideate webpage. This is our charge for this sort of conference experience. OLC is asking us to consider how we might create infrastructure, resources, and support to ensure that our digital learning environments are equitable and inclusive of all learners. So that's a that's a great question. That's our ask. I'm going to come back to that question. So my plan for today is we're going to have a conversation here about trauma in the context of diversity, equity, inclusion. But this is going to be our guiding question. We're looking to make our digital learning environments more equitable, inclusive for all learners. Okay, so keeping in mind that we're going to de-stress and we're not going to try to run the entire universe. Okay, so I thought of some questions that we could kind of build off of that big guiding question specific to trauma. So I want to share some questions that I have with you, and then I'm going to pause and I'm going to open it up to the group and see if you all have any questions specific to trauma-aware teaching and diversity, equity, inclusion. So my first question is, how does trauma create barriers to learning, and how does trauma create barriers to teaching? We got to remember both of those. What about student and faculty support? So I've been hearing a lot of conversations that a lot of staff on our campuses have been feeling like the conversation is focusing on faculty stress and that sometimes staff stress is not considered. So how can we remove those barriers? My next question is, you may have heard the term resilience in the literature. Resilience is a word that I introduce. It's part of the trauma literature, and then I stop using it because it irks me and it's often misused. I prefer to say we contain multitudes. So we are strong, complex beings as we are also experiencing the stress and trauma. So I want us to keep that strengths-based concept in mind. How can we build upon our strengths as we're having this conversation? And last but not least, how can we be critical and creative consumers of trauma research? So one of the things that you'll see when you start, if you decide to go further into this conversation, is that a red flag for me is when conversations about trauma, for example, leave out racism as a type of trauma. So if I see that, I'm saying to myself, something's off here, right? Because racism is recognized as a type of trauma. Racism is a type of trauma. So if there is not a lens around diversity and equity inclusion in a trauma resource or in a trauma conversation, I'm concerned. I'm looking at that with a critical eye. So one of my goals here today is to kind of send you all off to do more research and more learning, but to keep in mind to be critical and creative consumers of what you encounter. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. These are the questions that I'd like us to chew on today. And I have a couple more slides and then I'm going to move it into gallery mode so we can chat. Are there other questions that folks have? And I'm going to take a closer look at the chat here about the connections between diversity, equity, inclusion, and trauma-aware teaching. The first thing I see in the chat is that Clea is here and she's talking about her cat. Hi, Clea. Thank you. Okay. No, sorry. Y'all know I love an active chat and I like people to engage in whatever way they need to. So I see a conversation about resilience. Lara has shared resilience and grit make me want to crawl into a hole. So maybe that's a question. How is the word resilience often used to stifle conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, and things like, conversations about systemic racism and systemic oppressions. How do we sometimes use that word resilience and grit against people? Resilience, Maha's here, is Maha's thinking about a deficit model. Blames the person, not the system. So that might be something that we want to keep in mind today. And if y'all aren't in that collaborative notes document, please do add that. Maslow, little plug for Angela Gibson, who's presenting on Maslow before Bloom, I believe later today. If people don't feel safe and secure, they can't function well. Absolutely. And we're going to touch on that today. Okay, good. So we've got some guiding questions. If you've got more in here, please do add them. I'm making a note to myself to touch on this concept of resilience. Yeah, Taz is sharing that bootstrapping narrative. So I'll expand on this at some point, but the word is in the literature, and it's important, I think, for us to know if we're going to be critical readers of that trauma literature. And we also have to recognize that it's often used by people who are trying to avoid accountability and place blame on individuals when systems are at work. Okay. So I want to give y'all some working definitions of, hello, slides. What did I do to my slides? Okay. I want to give y'all some working definitions of trauma. So let's try to get on the same page here and give y'all some working definitions of trauma. So before I give you a definition of trauma, I want to know how you define trauma. So let's start with you. Let's start with the learner. This is called activating prior knowledge. This is something I do in all of my sessions. Before I tell people what I know about something or what the working definition is, I like to start with you. So I'd like to invite you into the chat, and I see a great definition already from Heather. How do you define trauma? Heather is sharing a soul injury. That's a great way to think of it. And this doesn't have to be anything formal. This might be a word that comes to mind when you think about trauma. It might be how you think trauma, a symptom of trauma that you see. Long-term impacting event. Maha's also sharing something painful. It's affecting us. Even when even when the trauma has ended, it's still affecting us. We'll come back to that. That's an important point. Something that changes our lives. It changes us. Quite literally, trauma changes us. It changes our brains. It changes our brains. Yeah, Laura's sharing changes our brains and our bodies. Thank you. Nor has shared expecting a lot from self and then not able to do it. I really like that, Nor. I really like that. And I think that kind of goes back to how I started us out, that we have this expectation of ourselves that we have to fix all of these things that need to be fixed. But there can also go along with that a feeling of not being able to do anything, which is a very common response to trauma. Generational, absolutely. Excellent definitions here. So good news. You all already know a lot about trauma. So let's build on what you already know. Okay. Here is this, I'm going with SAMHSA again. SAMHSA is a great resource. I reference it a lot. It's not perfect, but, oh, sugar, I didn't mean to click on that. Okay. Graham's back. I'm going to pop this link in the chat. This is for the SAMHSA resource on defining trauma. So I'm not going to read this to you, but there's a couple important points here. Experienced by an individual. In some ways, you know the saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Trauma is in the soul of the beholder, okay? So it is not up to us to say what somebody else is experiencing, whether or not that is trauma. It is a personal experience. What is traumatic for you might not be traumatic for me based on my genetics, my environment, my privilege, right? So we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion here. Some of us in this space carry much more privilege in society than others, and that will impact to some extent how we experience trauma. And we're going to talk about health disparities in a minute. So we can never, in the context of the online classroom, if we have a student that is sharing that they are, really traumatized by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are feeling like we're doing okay, right? That doesn't mean that what the student is experiencing isn't traumatic. It likely means that we're carrying a lot more privilege and have access to more resources than that student. Okay. So we got to keep in mind that it's not up to us to define anybody else's trauma. Trauma can be either harmful or life-threatening. It does not need to be life-threatening, okay? That is a common misconception. It does not need to be life-threatening to be defined as trauma. And third, some of you touched on this in the chat, it has lasting impacts. It changes us, okay, on a variety of levels. Questions about this definition of trauma? And I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. One of the other definitions I've heard is that trauma is something that is unbearable. And that's a really short definition. In unbearable meaning we can't handle it. We can't handle that big thing that happens. So we kind of push it down and we survive it. And then it lingers and it continues to impact us. Okay. Let me be clear here before I'm looking at my speaker's notes, and those are in the slides as well. So keeping diversity, equity, inclusion in mind, does everybody see how racism fits into the definition of trauma, right? Any type of micro or macro aggressions due to our identity, right, would fit under the definition of trauma. There's a great book called Racial Battle Fatigue in Higher Education that you can Google that. I'm sure somebody can grab that link, that speaks to specifically racism in higher ed and how that plays out. Abuse, neglect, serious accidents. And yes, in the context of DEI, racism fits under this definition, okay? And that might be new to folks, and that's okay. All right, we're going to start where we are. So I just listed several of these examples of trauma. Most of these are probably familiar. We're very familiar with things like car accidents being an example of trauma. Some of these might be new. These are all defined in the trauma literature now as examples of trauma. So this is not Karen defining trauma. You'll see notes in the speaker's notes where you can pull these references. Thanks, Heather, for sharing that link. I want to point out man-made or natural disasters. So pandemics do fall under that. I would argue that we are experiencing a massive collective trauma at this time. Folks may disagree with me, but what I'm seeing in the literature and the research is that many people are acknowledging the pandemic as a massive collective trauma. Okay. Within that, it's important to recognize that even before COVID, there were folks who were arguing that trauma is universal. That said, the rates of lifetime trauma exposure hover in the literature between 65 to 80%. So this is in this space right now. I don't know how many people are in this room, but however many people in this room, trauma's in this room, trauma's in our classrooms, trauma's in our meetings, okay? PTSD prevalence, however, is smaller. PTSD is a very specific severe and treatable manifestation of trauma, but not all trauma is PTSD. Okay, so it's important to kind of have those basic definitions in mind so we can engage with that conversation. Couple more definitions, and then I want to talk to you about the health disparities in trauma, and then I'm going to open us up to gallery view. Have folks heard of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, or is this new to people? Let me know in the chat a yes or no. Okay, good. Oh, I see a lot of news. So I want to give a little content warning here. When I discovered ACEs, it's a bit of a rabbit hole that you can go down. I am going to share a link with you that you can do your own self-assessment on ACEs. Please walk very gently into that space. This can bring up a lot of stuff, right? So please just, if you're not having the best day or you're feeling overwhelmed, maybe save this content for later. This link is in the speaker's notes as well. This is a link that you can do your own ACEs self-assessment. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. So they include things like abuse, living with a parent with mental illness, and various types of childhood trauma. I want to share, there's some good data on this. This comes from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's amazing. And she's written a book about childhood trauma. I want to point you to the second point on the right. If left untreated, children with a high ACE score face a 20-year decrease in life expectancy. So what that says is children who have 4 or more indicators of adverse childhood experiences, that's kind of the magic number in ACE's world, have a 20-year decrease in life expectancy. So this data is like incredibly compelling, right? And there's Nadine Burke-Harris has a TED Talk, which will totally blow your mind. But it's really important here to keep in mind what we're talking about. We're talking about what some people consider to be the public health issue of our time. So as we're thinking about that question of creating equitable learning environments for everyone in a digital classroom, keep this in mind that there are very incredibly serious impacts to trauma. Okay. So when we're thinking about how we can help people learn, it's important to keep this in the background. And a note there that trauma is both that can be an overwhelming statistic. Trauma is both treatable and preventable. So when we educate ourselves about it, we can do something about it. There are significant trauma disparities across different racial groups. I pulled COVID-19 data, and the link is in the speaker's notes for y'all. We know that communities of color are not experiencing this pandemic in the same way as those who carry more privilege and access to health resources, right? So I'm not going to read you this, but when we're talking about trauma in the classroom, our students are experiencing COVID-19 in different ways, depending on their privilege and their access to resources. So it's important to keep that in mind. You might have students who are largely able to isolate, and their lives are kind of, they're obviously taking this in, but they're able to go on as business as usual. You've got other students who've lost multiple family members to this pandemic, who are themselves working on the front lines and might not have access to healthcare. Okay, so we always want to put that lens on when we're looking at these questions of trauma. Keeping in mind, I mentioned this before, that how trauma plays out varies by our privilege and our identity. Okay, I gave y'all another quote here. There's a lot of really, really compelling and disturbing research about LGBTQ youth and homelessness, particularly during the pandemic, often due to family rejection, right? So again, we're looking at disparities here, and it's important to keep these in mind. All right, so that was some background information for you all on trauma. We know what trauma is. And we know that it doesn't impact us in the same way, depending on the privilege that we carry. And there's a tension there. Trauma is nearly universal. And so it's impacting all of us, regardless of our privilege. And our privilege impacts how the level of support that we're able to get to deal with trauma. Okay, so I want to bring this back to that big question of teaching and learning. And I would like folks to share. I'm going to ask you to brainstorm a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to the discussion. How does trauma impact learning in the classroom, and particularly in the online learning classroom? Please give it a share in the chat. How does trauma impact learning? What do you see when you suspect that there's students in your classroom who are experiencing trauma? How do you think that shows up in your online classroom? Distraction, I'm seeing that word twice. Ability to engage. Every day people say to me, how do we engage students? And now we're saying trauma impacts our ability to engage. Concentration, memory. Yeah. I hear stories. I heard of some faculty, someone was expressing frustration, who are holding hard and fast deadlines and not allowing any flexibility with deadlines. And what I said to that is you're not grading those students on the assignments they submit, you're grading students on their trauma and their access to resources. So we do know that trauma impacts all of the things that you all are sharing in the chat. So we got to really be thinking about what we're actually assessing when we know that trauma has those impacts. Let's switch the question now to teaching. How does trauma impact teaching? And please conceptualize teaching in whatever way you need to. If you are a faculty developer, you are teaching. If you are a vice president of faculty affairs, you are teaching. If you are in the classroom, you are teaching. If you are a parent, you are teaching. How does trauma impact your teaching? And you might have some personal experiences to share there. Maha, thank you so much. A short fuse. Yeah. Overwhelm. Thank you, Daisha. Trails saying avoiding certain subjects, right? Maybe we feel there's things we can't talk about because of what we're dealing with. Our own inability to focus, maybe missing appointments or deadlines. All of these are true. You all know a lot about what goes on with trauma. Kate is reminding us to have a strengths-based focus. It's making me more empathetic. Anyone else feel that they are more empathetic? That would be a very normal reaction. And it would also be a very normal reaction to trauma to feel less empathetic, to feel at the end of your fuse, and to experience that. Both of those can be true. Great answers here. I'm going to move us into, I'm going to open this up for discussion and questions. You have the slide deck. These are all some resources for you to go more, to do further learning. So you've got my website. If you haven't heard of the work of Dina Simmons, she's written a piece that I've linked to here that says, if you are not talking about racism in the classroom, you are not trauma informed. My friend Alex Bennett has written a book. It's coming out called Equity Centered Trauma Informed Education. Several other resources there. I do also want to point out that New York Times article, Call It What It Is, Anti-Black Racism, was something that was shared with me this summer. And that was really a transformational read for me to think about that specific concept of anti-Black racism and how that plays out in our classrooms. Several other resources for you there. ADHD and trauma. We're talking a lot about how our ADHD learners are figuring things out in the online classroom. And then, did I pull this book next to me or did I put it away? Bandwidth Recovery. I thought I had it in my pile. No, I don't. Bandwidth Recovery is a great book, helping students to reclaim cognitive resources lost to poverty, racism, and social marginalization. Okay. So these are, we only have 45 minutes. So these are further learning resources. I want to bring us back to this question, and then I'm going to stop the slides. So the question we were challenged with at the beginning was how to create infrastructure, resources, and support to ensure that all of our learners are able to succeed in our digital learning environments. So I'm going to, maybe I'm not going to. And I'm also going to pop some additional questions in the chat for us to consider. So how does trauma show up specifically in our virtual learning environments, and how can we better support our faculty, students, and learners? So I'm going to stop sharing. Brady Bunch. And I'm going to open this up to questions. So based on what we just talked about, recognizing what trauma is, recognizing that it's nearly universal or universal, recognizing that it has tremendous impacts on teaching and learning, and recognizing that there are lots of disparities in how we are impacted by trauma and our access to resources to help us move through that trauma. Recognizing that, how can we create digital learning environments that are equitable and inclusive for all learners? That's our charge. So I'm going to pause here. Does anybody, if you'd like to raise your IRL hand, I can see most of you. If you'd like to raise your blue virtual hand, or if you'd like to share in the chat a question, I'd love for folks to come off mute so I can be quiet. And we'll start there. Questions or comments about what we can do to make our digital learning environments equitable for all students? I see Nora has a question. Is this not the responsibility of health and wellness departments in universities to extend support? How can faculty support? So yes, this is trauma is a shared responsibility. So one of the things that I talk to folks about is that our number one, our counseling services centers are incredibly under-resourced. The last place I had a full-time gig, there was one full-time counselor for 6,000 students. This was at a community college. So these were students who had very little access to private counseling resources, right? The ratio was 1 to 6,000. Yes, I said 6,000. Okay. So we cannot, in good conscience, push all of this onto our health and wellness centers or counseling centers. Okay. That said, I am not a counselor. I'm not a clinician. My expertise is in pedagogy. So I look at this through the lens of what's happening in the college classroom. If I know that trauma is impacting students' ability to learn, and my role is I'm faculty as well and supporting faculty, then I need to educate myself about trauma. And I need to create inclusive classrooms that are designed for trauma awareness. One of the first resource on that resource page that I shared with y'all does link to a trauma aware teaching checklist. So there's a lot we can do. We're not meant to counsel our students. We're not counselors. That would actually be putting both of us at risk. But we are meant, there's a lot that we can do within the model of a trauma-informed pedagogy. Great question.
Oh, Karen, if I might. Said,
yes.
Yes, come off mute.
Hi, Kristen.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, please. Yay for coming off mute, Kristen. Thank you. Go ahead.
Everybody. Now, one of the things that we've discovered through our own data analysis as well, we've worked to create robust support for students through the form of counseling, student success coaches, and resources. Students, especially in the online environment, feel most comfortable often reaching to their instructor first. Their instructor is their main point of contact. It's the person that they're interacting with every day. So regardless of what we think is the right place for them to go, usually they go to their instructors. So a lot of our work has been, because faculty come to us and say, I'm not a counselor. I don't know how to handle this. What can I do? And our charge has been, of course, helping our faculty to be compassionate and kind, but also really showering our faculty with support systems and clear steps for how to support them and the student when those doors open up.
Can we make sure showering our faculty with support systems gets put into the collaborative notes? Because I would like to be a part of doing that. We need to shower our faculty with support systems. Kristen, that's fantastic. Are folks resonating with that? Those who teach online or work with folks who teach online, the students are going to go right to their faculty first, right? So they're going to come to us, as many of my students do, and say, I'm having mental health challenges. I'm overwhelmed. I didn't get the assignment in because somebody's in the hospital. They're going to present all of these traumas and stresses to us while we're managing our own trauma and stress. So we've got to help faculty understand what is and isn't theirs. When I presented in, I don't even know what month, was it the last Ideate? I talked about a scope of practice for faculty. I have a book chapter that I'm working on about the idea of a scope of practice. So a scope of practice is a chart. I like charts. It says this is yours and this is not yours, right? So we're not meant to provide counseling, but we can refer to counseling, right? We're not meant to provide counseling, but we can listen to students. We can practice empathy in our classrooms. We can educate ourselves about anti-racism, right? That is something that is within my scope of practice as an educator. Taz, did you have a question? I kind of lost it in the chat or a comment. I'm putting you on the spot, but I know you can handle it.
Okay. No, I'm first of all, I'm getting so much out of the session. So thank you for accomplishing what you did in 35 minutes. The question about where is the point of restructuring. So I also do workshops at my university, we call them hot moments, which is a terrible name, but it's basically when trauma manifests itself in the classroom, right? Like there's some culminating incident. And what I've found is that with instructors I work with, most of them are open-minded, but there are also those who are so concerned with grading and cheating and being fair and not having the expertise to discern. And so I had offered in the chat that perhaps grading and notions of academic dishonesty and the weight that we put on those kinds of things might be a key point of restructuring.
So that has been a very I'm going to allow myself a little stress relief giggle there before the conversation about surveillance tech. Maha, I don't know if you have a link to the I don't know what day it was that
surveillance. I'll put the link here.
There was an event. I lose words. I'm sure we all do. I've been thinking a lot about the question of surveillance tech and proctoring tech in the context of trauma awareness. On multiple levels, the experiences students are reporting that they're having while they're being surveilled and using those proctoring services, and the amount of money we're investing in them when we have massive massively under-resourced mental health services on our campuses during what many people are considering an extraordinarily terrible mental health crisis. So I've been thinking about it from both of those lenses. You know, that obsession with grading is really interesting, because what are we grading? Are we grading the student's learning experience, or are we grading how quickly they can get an assignment done? Are we grading their executive function skills? Are we grading their access to trauma support? So I think it's important to name when people are pushing back on that, to ask that question of what are we actually grading and what are we actually assessing? For me, things like flexible deadlines are incredibly important, because I am recognizing that not everybody learns at the same pace, and that trauma impacts executive function skills. So my ability to meet a deadline is impacted by the extent to which I'm experiencing trauma and stress. So if somebody gives me a flexible deadline, I can probably get that done. But if somebody has a hard deadline, I might not be able to. But it's not because I don't know the content or that I can't do a good job on that assignment. It's because I need more time. So I think we got to really dig at the root, try to get people to dig at the root, and talk about what are we actually doing. Some people say we're not grading, we're sorting, right? Here's the group of students who have lots of resources and who are having a lesser trauma experience. And here's the students who have less resources and are extremely traumatized. And we're sorting them into those two buckets when we assign these grades.
Karen,
maybe
if I could just hop in.
Go ahead.
The opposite is also true for faculty who are falling behind in grading, and the kind of guilt and shame that faculty are feeling because students are waiting for them. And I had a consultation recently where a faculty finally just told them, like, hey, here are all the terrible things happening in my life. And immediately the tone of the classroom changed. So I just want to say that as an example for how this works both ways.
Taz, I love you, and I love what you just said, because we got to recognize, we got to come at this from both sides, right? So I always try to keep in mind that faculty working conditions are student learning conditions, and that faculty are going through this too. And every time I extend those deadlines, I'm backing myself up with grading, and I struggle with that, and it's really challenging. I know we're at 2 minutes. There's a lively chat going on. Please continue the conversation with me on Twitter. You've got the slides, do with those what you will. Keep coming back to more of these sessions. My final note that I want to emphasize is please take care of yourselves. So it's incredibly difficult to do this work if we are burning out. And my sense is that most of us to some extent are burning out, and that might be unavoidable based on what's going on in the world. But we've got to do things like taking breaks, asking for help. Please do what you can to take care of yourself today. I have I throw everything in the kitchen sink at my self-care, and I have a whole bunch of strategies that I use. And some days that works and some days it doesn't, but please know that it's okay to take care of yourselves, and to be well to the extent that you can.